Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I am Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bill's back again.
Andrew back again.
It always goes so quickly.
In the chair. That's it. Well, coming out to our viewers and our listeners on a weekly basis, we have to keep it up. We've got to be consistent, right? So,
Exactly right.
That's it. Andrew, lead us in, mate. What are we talking to everybody about today?
Yes. So today we're doing a bit of a deep dive into ethical investments. We've probably heard the term before.
Yep.
There's been a lot of traction that's been gaining on it over the course of a number of years. But ethical investments, sustainable investments, what are they? How do they work? And even just having a bit of a chat about them.
Sounds like a plan, and I think it's a fairly serious and heavy type of topic, right? Because we're talking about the impact to the planet, the climate crisis, all of that sort of stuff. So we're going to take not necessarily a different approach, but we're going to try and keep it quite light. And yeah, let's just see where we go with it, I think.
Let's see.
Absolutely. So I guess the first part is, what is ethical investing?
Yeah. Look, everyone's definition is different, is the first thing that I'll put out there. Ethical investments are basically that it's an investment. You're making an investment decision, so it's obviously for wealth creation purposes, but it's avoiding some areas. Now, what those areas are changes and is different between each ethical or each fund manager. It changes and varies between each person. So whenever I get a client that comes in that says, look, I want to be invested in an ethical manner, and that's one of the questions that we ask, that is that something that's important to you, or is it something that you're not overly fussed with? It's just a matter of investing what makes the most amount of sense from a wealth perspective. Is what's investment to you? I mean, there's people that want to avoid gambling. There's people that want to avoid alcohol. There's people that want to avoid fossil fuels, mining, animal welfare. There's such a vast variety of things that you may want to avoid. So really trying to dig a little bit deeper and find out what is actually ethical to you is really important, because it varies from person to person.
Yeah, and then finding an investment preference that then matches that is another consideration. And we'll talk about the visibility of the underlying investments. But as an example, let's say, you want to avoid the alcohol industry.
Yep.
So, you've got exposure to a bank, I don't know, as an example, but you don't know if the bank lends money to, I don't know, Dan Murphy, so the Endeavour Group, because they're building a new Dan Murphy's or a new national rollout or whatever it is. So by its very definition, you may have sidestepped the direct investment, but indirectly through something else you may be getting exposure to it, and you don't know. So I think visibility is a really big one, and it's getting better, but it's still really difficult to go that way. And look, it's probably the best way to think about it is it's not all or nothing. I think it's, yes, I want exposure to ethical investments, knowing that it's not going to be extremely black and white. That's probably the best way to look at it, but I always found it interesting because it's ethical, but to what degree is it ethical? Yeah.
Well, it's a conundrum, right? Like, how many degrees of separation makes it okay? If you're giving money to person B, if person A is giving money to person B and person B is unethical, great, avoid that, because that doesn't meet your definition in terms of, your ethics, your morals, all of that stuff. But if I'm giving money to person C that's then giving it to person B, is it ethical or is it not? Okay, maybe it's not. And what if I give it to person C, who gives it to person D, who then gives it back to person B? How many degrees of separation is going to make it ethical, and how many? What's it going to take for it to actually constitute an ethical investment to you? I think that the important thing to note is it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be things that are, not going to be 100% in line with what you're wanting to do, and recognizing that and knowing that is important, because having line of sight on absolutely everything is impossible. Every business transaction, every iteration with a company that you're investing in, making sure that every single party involved is ethical is impossible. What you're trying to do is just make it more morally conscious, more ethical, more towards what you'd like to see from an ethics and a morals perspective.
Yeah, and how far do you go? I mean, look, I've got probably two worked examples here. The first one of my other heroes other than Warren Buffett, my mate Elon Musk. So let's talk about EVs, right? Electric vehicles. So you talk about, the Teslas of the world, obviously moving to an electric vehicle, not needing to use fossil fuel and petrol in order to fill up your car, right? Yeah. But you're getting electricity somehow to your house to fill up your EV using electricity. How is that electricity getting produced? Have you got solar panels, and have you got a battery, and are you completely off the grid? Or are you just plugging it into the, how a usual house is connected, that you're getting power generated by the electricity grid, but where is that power getting generated from?
Yeah.
Is that green? Is that ethical? And then you take it one step further. At the end of the life of the battery, what's happening with the batteries?
Yeah.
What about the lithium that's being used to produce the batteries? Is that some mining company out in the middle of, I don't know, some African village that's taking advantage of, the people that live there? You just don't know. But that's the point about the visibility part that's really difficult. And I guess the other example that I've got too, and this one's probably a little bit closer to home, I think we could all say that moving to sustainable energy is a good idea. So let's take wind farms for argument's sake. Yep, great. Everyone will say, fantastic. It's ethical. It's green. Away you go. But I've got family who are farmers. If their properties are being installed with the wind farm, then that's causing harm and detriment to them.
Yeah.
So is it that, okay, somebody's going to cop it for the greater good of society and the planet? Because once again, there's a degree in that, but it just gets, it's a really complicated position, I guess, and it's different for everybody.
Exactly right. So figuring out what is ethical to you is kind of the first stop, and understanding that, it's not going to be 100% perfect, but you're just trying to align things more than what you would otherwise if it was just, free for all.
And then having the faith and the confidence in where you are investing your money,
yeah,
that the businesses that you are investing in are aligned in terms of, their degree of ethical investing, sustainable investing. And once again, that's getting better, but it's still difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you start talking about the visibility side of things, it does become much more difficult once you then start talking about, fund managers. Take us through that.
A fund manager, essentially, you're getting a pool of money, and you've got most of the time an investment objective. So you may turn around and say, we specialize in investing in this particular segment of the marketplace.
Yep.
They then take that money that investors give them and try and deploy that to get obviously a decent rate of return in businesses, projects, industries that they think are going to match their objectives and get the type of return that they're chasing. In the event that it's a sustainable fund or an ethical fund, they're looking for projects in particular. And once again, the degree varies quite heavily, but they're looking at something that says, okay, we're going to support, I don't know, changing the energy that we have to a greener energy, hydrogen projects, wind farms, water turbines, things like that. Taking that money and deploying it, and basically saying, okay, what we're doing this for is to not only invest and get a rate of return and support that industry, but we're also going to support industries that are ethical and are sustainable and take a overview and a consideration of the impact that it's having to the planet, to the environment, to the communities that they're operating in.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, a challenge, because if you've got more and more money coming in, you've got to deploy that money, because you can't have it sitting on the sideline. You've got to get a rate of return.
Yeah.
But really, this should help, hopefully, accelerate the growth towards, I guess, from an energy perspective, more sustainable energy uses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also a trust element in that the fund manager is doing exactly what they say that they're doing.
Yep.
Because when you're looking at, investing through fund managers, you don't have 100% visibility as to all of their holdings in every single company that they're investing in. You've only got really a lot of the times, top 10 holdings
Yep.
is what you're looking at, as opposed to, their entire asset base. So there's an element of trust there that they're actually doing what they say that they're doing, and that they're not, going around the legal implications of, or going around what they're actually saying that they're doing as a bit of a marketing ploy.
Yeah, and look, on that, that's probably a really good pivot into competing priorities.
Yeah.
So as an individual, I guess it's fair to say, and it's an assumption that we need to make, that people need to and want to invest their money to get a rate of return to grow their wealth.
Yep.
That's pretty straightforward. You've got this competing priority, I think, to get as much of a return as you can with the least amount of risk. But then you've got obviously the ethical and the sustainable overlay that says, okay, if I go this way and I'm investing in something sustainable and ethical, what's my investment return in comparison to a different option that I can have? Now, we don't have the answer, but it'd be interesting enough how the balance works, as in the trade-off. Do you go down the ethical part and get a different rate of return versus going the other way and then getting a different rate of return? And I guess that's an individual's decision, but how do you then find common ground and say, yep, this is the way that I'm going to go, if there's a discrepancy between investment returns? And there's obviously a difference in cost, and we'll get into that, about ethical funds versus non-ethical funds and the like. But, it all sounds good, and I'm trying to play devil's advocate here. It all sounds good on paper, assuming that the investment return is sound. But if the investment return is not sound, and let's just say you do this over a long period of time, and it means the difference between, we'll talk about retirement, a comfortable retirement with a lot of money versus not a comfortable retirement because you've decided to go down the ethical part. And I'm not suggesting that ethical funds do not perform, but where do you then get to?
Yeah.
And do you turn around and say, actually, I probably should have been more selfish and gone down that part because I need to look after me and my family? It's a really difficult position.
It really is. It is. And look, I think naturally you expect, and this is not every fund, so I'm speaking in very general terms here and trying to be a little bit careful around the way that I'm saying it, but you naturally expect that an average ethical fund is not going to perform as well as another fund. I mean, you consider having a flexibility to invest in a million different assets, and then narrowing that down from 1 million different assets to 1,000 different assets. You've got a narrower pool, and so naturally you're going to miss out on some of the overperformers in terms of investment options. So on average, and this is not every single fund, you'd expect that an ethical fund has a narrow focus, has a narrower investment pool that it can generate a rate of return from, and so by its very nature is going to have a far more concentrated rate of return. It's unfortunate, but it's just a matter of those are the things that you need to start balancing when you're looking at going down this option, especially if you're sort of sitting on the fence. There's a part of the aspects of making an informed decision.
No, you're absolutely right, and it is becoming more accessible and more available. The awareness is definitely out there. We're finding that when we're talking to clients and asking them these questions, there is a greater appetite for it as well too. Andrew, let's talk about maybe the costs of the underlying investments as well compared to something more traditional. How does that stack up as well? Because you're talking about the concentration, obviously the research, needing to find those opportunities. How does that, because that adds cost to running the investment.
Exactly.
How does that then stack up?
Yeah, so look, most ethical fund managers, most ethical pooled investments do attract a higher cost. There is obviously the need for additional research, because you're not just researching, the financials of the companies. You're not just researching the investment aspect of the companies, which should still be the cornerstone, because you're obviously investing, and sometimes that can get forgotten when you're talking about ethical investments. There's also the additional cost of researching the investments in the companies to make sure that they meet their ethical objectives. So because of that added layer of research, because of that added work that's involved in ethical investments, generally you expect to pay a higher cost for an ethical investment.
Yeah,
and look,
a lot in that.
There's other ways to go around it, and not everyone has this option, but looking at direct investments as opposed to fund managers or the like means that you can do the research yourself to some degree. Whether or not that's going to result and yield the same from a rate of return perspective, and even from a research into those companies and the accessibility of information. But direct investment is a way to try to sidestep some of the additional costs that are involved by going through fund managers, some of the lack of visibility, because you know exactly where you're investing or what the companies are. Still is obviously some lack of visibility. There's some lack of diversification, because you're investing in a narrower pool of assets by going directly as opposed to a fund manager style of investment. But that's one of the ways to have a greater level of control around these investments and around investing in companies that you're 100% confident and comfortable in is go down the direct route rather than a fund manager.
Yeah, and once again, I guess that's a completely different ball game as well too, because being able to do that, having the appetite for it, the time frame associated with it, the skill set associated with it, can get quite onerous for someone.
Yeah.
So you'd need to be pretty dedicated, I imagine, to go down that path. But the positive thing is that there's more investment options available, and getting advice and going down that path is something that we're talking all the time to people about anyway, and giving them that option as well. So I think there's more awareness, there's more access to it.
Yeah.
There's greater investment opportunities, especially with
looking at trying to invest in an ethical portfolio 7-8 years ago. It was you got you got an option of one or two, and that's about it, whereas now the options out there are significantly more.
And especially with the push with a lot of governments trying to achieve a certain level of emissions by a certain time frame. There's obviously some big projects that are coming through the pipeline right across the world as governments continue those initiatives. So those investment options are there, and I think we're talking about a long time frame in terms of how long is the pipeline of this. Energy is one in particular, and we've seen that closer to home, I guess, with the sales of electric vehicles starting to go through the roof and really starting to compete with, in terms of number of EVs sold, compete with your more traditional petrol and diesel powered vehicles. We expect that to continue, but then you've got your bigger projects like your wind farms and your hydrogen and your turbines and stuff like that.
That'll take a little bit more time to actually start flowing through.
A little bit more time and a little bit more money. But look, I think with all of these things, yes, you can go yourself, but having that conversation with your advisor, it should be something that is a lot more common these days, and it should be something that's discussed anyway.
Absolutely.
Andrew,
thanks for another podcast, Bills. A different change and a different tune to some of the things that we normally talk about. But yeah, ethical investments. It's another thing that's been coming up more and more, and it's a topical point to jump on.
That's it. And to our listeners and to our viewers, hopefully you got a bit out of today's episode. If you want any further information, our contact details are in the show notes, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks again.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.